Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome back to Dreamy Historian, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight begins our peaceful journey through the House of Windsor, a modern royal dynasty that has weathered storms and guided Britain through a century of unprecedented change from 1910 to today. In Part 1, we'll softly explore the early Windsor reigns of George V and Edward VIII. From a steadfast king who steered the nation through world war and social upheaval, to a monarch who chose love over crown in one of history's most dramatic royal moments, all while the world transformed around them. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about your favorite royal moment, and subscribe to keep these soothing tales coming your way. So, cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 20th century lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. George, later King George V, was born on June 3, 1865, at Marlborough House, Westminster, London. His father, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, was Queen Victoria's eldest son and heir, often at odds with her over his carefree reputation. George's mother, Alexandra of Denmark, from the Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg, Glücksburg royal house, wed Albert Edward in 1863. Their first son, Albert Victor, born in 1864, made George, their second child, third in line to the throne. The mighty couple had 4 more children, daughters Louise, Victoria, and Maud, and a son, Alexander John, who died a day after his premature birth in 1871. Raised by nannies across royal estates like Windsor and Sandringham, George had limited parental contact, typical for the era. He and Albert Victor, close in age, shared lessons under John Neil Dalton, a clergyman recommended by Queen Victoria, who felt their father neglected their studies. From 1871, Dalton oversaw a curriculum heavy on Protestant texts, Greek and Roman texts, prioritizing humanities over sciences. George, more diligent than his elder brother, bonded with Dalton, a friendship lasting decades. At 12, their father enrolled them in the Royal Navy. In 1877, they began training, and by 1879, joined HMS Bacchante, a new corvette, with Dalton tutoring. Despite Victoria's fears, the ship proved sturdy in an 1879 storm, allowing a 3-year voyage covering 40,000 miles. They visited the Mediterranean, Caribbean, South America, South Africa, China, Japan, meeting Emperor Meiji in 1881, and Australia, witnessing Japan's modernization and the First Boer War in South Africa. Their travels were published in 1886 as the cruise of Her Majesty's ship Bacchante. George thrived at sea, continuing as a naval commander, while Albert went to Trinity College, Cambridge. In the mid-1880s, George trained under his uncle, Prince Alfred, in Malta, becoming a vice admiral by 1886. By 1890, he commanded HMS Thrush, a gunboat in the Western Atlantic, and in 1891, HMS Melampus, a cruiser, his final active command. George expected his father to succeed Victoria, followed by Albert Victor. But Albert's questionable lifestyle, including unproven links to an 1889 London scandal and health concerns, made him a controversial heir. In 1892, the Russian flu claimed Albert at 27, thrusting George second in line, destined to be king if he outlived his father. This shift reshaped his future and personal life. At the time that he fell ill in December 1891, Albert had been scheduled to marry Mary of Teck, the daughter of Count Francis von Hohenstein, Duke of Teck, one of the most senior figures in the German aristocracy. Although George had grown close to his cousin, Princess Marie of Edinburgh, who herself would one day become Queen of Romania, the decision of who he should marry was now largely taken out of his hands, and it was decided that he should marry Mary of Teck, his older brother's intended bride. The pair were wed at St. James's Palace on the 6th of July, 1893, in what, by all accounts, became a relatively happy union, despite its arranged nature. Children soon followed, with Edward born a year later in the summer of 1894, Albert late in 1895, Mary in 1897, Henry in 1900, George in 1902, and John in 1905. All except John, who unfortunately developed severe epilepsy and passed away in 1919 when he was just 13 years old, would live long lives. As parents, George and Mary were not easy to define. George was a very strict disciplinarian like his own father. This was not unusual by the standards of the late 19th century, but George appears to have instilled significant fear in his children, while he and Mary have also been criticized for failing to notice that a string of nannies that cared for the children in their earlier years were often emotionally and physically abusive towards them. However, on some occasions, their children expressed affection for their parents in their later years. And when George and Mary had to undertake a world tour for 8 months in 1901, they were said to be deeply upset at being separated from the children for such an extended period of time. Overall, it was a complicated relationship between the pair and their children. George had become Duke of York in 1892, following the death of his older brother, a title which had been borne for centuries by many figures who were second in line to the throne of England and then Britain. His new position meant that he had to quit active service with the Royal Navy of any kind, which might endanger his well-being. As such, following his marriage to Mary in 1893, much of their roles as Duke and Duchess were ceremonial and designed to expose the British people as much as possible to the man who would one day, perhaps many years from then, rule Britain and its empire. Thus, social engagements and photo opportunities became the order of the day, though unlike his father, George was not an avid partygoer and generally preferred a quiet life at York Cottage in Sandringham to hobnobbing with British high society. Some of his formal duties involved travel overseas, notably when George joined his parents to attend the funeral of their cousin, Tsar Alexander III of Russia in St. Petersburg in 1894. There he spent considerable time in the presence of his cousin, the new Tsar Nicholas II, whose rule would become entangled in many ways with George's years later. George's time as Duke of York eventually came to an end in January 1901, following the death of his grandmother, Queen Victoria, after a reign of 63.5 years. With her passing, which signaled the end of an age in British and indeed European history, George's father, Albert Edward, succeeded as King Edward VII of Britain and Emperor of India. He was already 59 years of age at the time of his accession, and his health was deteriorating owing to a chronic smoking habit and years of excess of all kinds. He would spend much of his relatively brief reign dealing with bronchitis, as well as a form of skin cancer that attacked his nose and even memory loss. It was consequently expected that George, who had become the Prince of Wales and heir designate in 1901, would succeed his father before too long. Nevertheless, Edward survived throughout the 1900s as George and Mary took on a string of ever-growing responsibilities, notably a world tour in 1901, in which they visited the furthest flung reaches of the British Empire. There were several important aspects to this, notably his opening of the first session of the Australian Commonwealth Parliament and a visit to South Africa during the Second Boer War. Further visits to India and other parts of the empire followed in the course of the 1900s. Thus, by the time George's father died on the 6th of May 1910, the subjects of the empire, as well as Britain itself, were familiar with the man who now ascended as their new king. He was 44 years of age at the time. George's coronation as King George V of Britain and Emperor of India, along with the coronation of his wife Mary as Queen Consort, took place at Westminster Abbey in London on the 22nd of June, 1911. It was attended by an enormous number of the royal families and monarchs of Europe, including, for instance, members of the German imperial family, numerous other German princes and princesses, representatives of the Tsar of Bulgaria, the Romanian royal family, the Archduke Karl of Austria representing Emperor Franz Joseph, and even the Crown Prince of the Ottoman Empire as a stand-in for the Sultan. Within a few years, many of these imperial and royal houses would be shattered by the impact of the First World War. And although few could have even guessed at it in the summer of 1911, this would be one of the last times when the many royal lines of old Europe would congregate in one place for such an event. In tandem, the Festival of Empire was held at the Crystal Palace in London to celebrate George's coronation. At this, the Crystal Palace, which had first been built to house the first Great Exposition in 1851, became home to a myriad array of scenes designed to showcase the might of the British Empire at its height. In all, 300 buildings replicating elements of other buildings from across the empire were reconstructed inside the Crystal Palace. But even as the coronation plans were underway, there was a political crisis also raging in Britain. one which involved the new king in a surprising departure from the general belief by the early 20th century that the monarch's role was simply to rubber stamp what Parliament decided upon. At the heart of the matter was the People's Budget, which the Liberal Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, had first attempted to introduce in April 1909. The budget was very progressive for its time, with Lloyd George stating that it was effectively a wartime budget, with the enemy being poverty and squalor in Britain's working class and industrial communities. As such, it proposed large tax increases to pay for a revolutionary system of welfare measures and investment in public services. Much of this was political, with the Liberals believing that the best way to stall the rise of the Labour Party, who were perceived as dangerous radicals in the 1900s, was to introduce the welfare reforms which would prevent traditional Liberal voters from switching to Labour. Yet, the People's Budget provoked a furious response, and the Conservative-dominated House of Lords refused to ratify the passage of the budget. Traditionally, the Lords was seen as a rubber-stamping body, one which was not supposed to block legislation that had passed through Parliament. And so, the impasse over the People's Budget had provoked a constitutional crisis in the last months of the reign of Edward VII. By the time George ascended the throne, the budget had been allowed to pass through the Lords without a vote, ending the immediate crisis. But the new king was immediately faced with calls for constitutional reform of the House of Lords to ensure a development like this never occurred again. Within days of his accession, George was being petitioned by the Liberal Prime Minister Herbert Asquith about various methods of constitutional reform which would prevent another impasse of the kind which had recently been seen. This was particularly necessary as British parliamentary politics in the early 1910s was balanced on a knife edge, with the Ulster Unionists and the Irish Parliamentary Party often holding the balance of power between the Liberals and the Conservatives. One proposal which was floated was that George would agree to the creation of a large number of new Liberal peers who would turn the political balance in the House of Lords in favor of the Liberals and their allies. George was not entirely favorable to the idea of politicizing the creation of noble titles in this way, and in any event, the Conservatives were more inclined to make concessions when they learned of this plan. As a result, a compromise was reached in the shape of the Parliament Act of 1911. The Act contained two provisions. Firstly, it stated that the House of Lords could not veto bills relating to the budget and other financial issues henceforth once they had passed through the House of Commons. In return, the Conservatives received an unofficial promise that their majority in the House of Lords would not be overcome by packing it with newly created Liberal peers. George gave his assent to the Act in August 1911. In what is one of the most significant reforms of the constitutional relationship of the upper and lower houses of Parliament to each other in modern British history. Whatever government was going to control the political realm in Britain, one of their primary problems, whether Conservative, Liberal, or Socialist, was going to be Ireland. Ireland had long been a thorn in the side of the empire. As England had expanded its political control across the Atlantic archipelago in the late medieval and early modern periods, it had managed to bring Wales and Scotland under British control to a large extent and unite these disparate realms under a unified Protestant British state. But Ireland had always been problematic. Successive waves of conquest and colonization between the 12th and 17th centuries had succeeded in creating an English Protestant landholding class here, but the bulk of the population remained Irish and Roman Catholic, broadly opposed to British rule. This problem was compounded by the existence of a Scottish Presbyterian majority in the north of the island, who in turn were opposed to the Catholics further to the south. By George's time, politicians in England were determined to bring about some solution to the endless unrest in Ireland by granting some form of self-determination to the island, and if needs be, by separating the northern counties from the southern ones. But the political environment was highly fractious there by the early 1910s. As a consequence, the decision was taken that George should quickly visit Ireland following his accession to better reinforce the ties between the monarchy and the crown subjects in Ireland. George and Mary arrived at Dún Laoghaire near Dublin, a port which was then called Kingstown, on the 8th of July, 1911, just over 2 weeks after his coronation in London. The entourage was considerable, and 8 carriages were needed to bring the King and Queen to Dublin Castle, where they resided while in Ireland. Visits to the Phoenix Park on the western outskirts of the city and Leopardstown racetrack followed, as well as more charitable endeavors such as a visit to the Coombe Hospital in Dublin. Much effort was made to shroud the royal visit in a celebratory atmosphere, but there were tensions brewing underneath. Many of Dublin Corporation's politicians were nationalists and socialists who favored complete independence for Ireland from Britain and refused to participate in the events around the royal visit. While the King and Queen's visit to Cork, the Republican-dominated city in the south of the country, was undertaken in a very tense atmosphere where it was clear the new monarch was not welcome. This aside, George and Mary's route through Dublin was often lined by people cheering them. And when he left Ireland 5 days later, the king might well have imagined that with the right policies the island could still be reconciled to British rule. He would learn in time that this was certainly not the case. Ireland and all other parts of the empire were drawn increasingly towards conflict in the first years of George II's reign. For some time, Europe's great powers had been increasingly antagonistic towards one another. The Empire of Austria-Hungary, for example, was a rival of the Russian Empire for control over the Balkans, where the Ottoman Empire, the dominant regional power for many centuries, was in terminal decline. The French Republic had old grievances against the German Empire from the conquest of its eastern provinces of Alsace and Lorraine during the Franco-Prussian War at the start of the 1870s. And Britain had its own growing rivalry with Germany, the newly emergent continental power. Yet few saw a war of the kind which erupted in the summer of 1914 coming. In the end, it was a regional crisis caused by the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, by a Serb nationalist in the streets of Sarajevo, which cast the continent into war. By the start of August, the British, French, and Russians were at war with the Germans, Austrians, and Turks. As monarch, it fell to George to oversee the council, which decided that Britain would declare war on Germany in response to developments across the continent. He referred to these events in his diary later that day as a, quote, terrible catastrophe. But like many others, he was naively of the view that the First World War would be a quick affair. Instead, it dragged on for over 4 years of bloody trench warfare in northern France and elsewhere. The monarchy was somewhat compromised by the outbreak of the war, owing to the close relations which existed between Europe's major royal families by the early 20th century. Nearly all of the royal houses were intermarried, and George, Wilhelm II, the Kaiser of Germany, and Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, were all first cousins. Moreover, the king's paternal grandfather, Queen Victoria's husband Albert, had been Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a prominent German royal line. George and his family members still bore this title in 1914. Additionally, his wife Mary, although she had been born in England, was the daughter of Count Francis von Hohenstein, the Duke of Teck, within the German aristocracy. All of this created the rather embarrassing impression when the war broke out that the royal family were more German than English when their bloodlines were examined. Certain sections of the British press hammered away at this point endlessly. Thus, in July 1917, George caved to public pressure and issued a royal proclamation which changed the name of the royal house from the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the House of Windsor, a place long associated with the royal family, owing to the construction of Windsor Castle as a royal residence all the way back in the days of William the Conqueror in the 11th century, who ironically enough was a continental foreigner who conquered England. Beyond the concerns over the connections between the royal family and Germany, George and his family had a significant role to play in the conflict. Hundreds of members of the royal household and staff were enlisted in the war effort. For instance, the woodcutters from the Windsor Castle estate were sent to France as trench sappers. George himself first visited the trenches of northwest France in November 1914, the first of 5 such visits during the war, while Queen Mary joined him in 1917. Back in Britain, the King and Queen spent much of the mid-1910s visiting hospitals, nurses' stations, and clearinghouses to meet with wounded and discharged soldiers and sailors. George's 2 eldest sons, Edward and Albert, were also old enough to be involved in the armed forces during the war. Edward served in France and was awarded the Military Cross, while Albert served in the Royal Navy and was mentioned in dispatches for his role in the Battle of Jutland in 1916. The foremost naval engagement of the war between the British and the German navies, while care was taken to ensure that the heir and his younger brother were not placed at the core of the conflict. The fact that the king's sons were on active duty during the war aided in cementing the idea that the war was everyone's conflict, not just the lot of the average conscript. One of George's visits to France was to acknowledge the intensification of the conflict there. For 2 years, the Germans had been pressing towards Paris from Belgium. And for 2 years, the French and British, along with extensive detachments of Commonwealth soldiers from Canada, South Africa, India, Australia, and elsewhere, had pushed back. Then, in the summer of 1916, the British and French launched the Somme offensive against the German lines. The first day of the offensive, the 1st of July, 1916, led to the greatest number of casualties experienced by the British Army in history in one day. Over 19,000 soldiers were killed, and a further 38,000 were wounded or otherwise rendered unable to fight. Plans were quickly put in place for George to cross to France. And on the 10th of August, 1916, with the fighting still raging, he visited troops at Ypres and proceeded further down the British lines along the Somme. Curiously, he also met with General Henry Rawlinson, the commander of the British Second Army, with whom the king conversed about the news of efforts within the military to have General Douglas Haig, the commander of the British forces in France, replaced. Yet, this never materialized. Haig remained in overall control of the British Expeditionary Force, while the slaughter at the Somme continued, eventually resulting in the deaths of approximately 300,000 troops. Yet, the stalemate in the war was not broken, and 2 more years of trench warfare in northeastern France would follow. While there was no change in military leadership in 1916, there was a change in the government back home in Britain. At the outset of the war in 1914, the Liberal Party led by Herbert Asquith as Prime Minister had a tenuous hold on power in Britain. To gain increased political stability during wartime, a unity government was formed, with the Conservatives being granted numerous important ministries and the Labour Party, which was still viewed as a dangerous socialist movement by many in Britain, even being invited to join the government. However, by late 1916, Asquith's coalition was increasingly unpopular at home and facing growing opposition over its prosecution of the war, notably the costliness in lives and resources of the Somme offensive, which had promised much and delivered little. He was eventually ousted from power in December 1916 when the Secretary of State for War, David Lloyd George, formed a new unity coalition and became Prime Minister. By the early 20th century, the king had little say in these matters and accepted Lloyd George as the new Prime Minister. However, it would be a tense relationship between the pair at times in the years that followed, with the conservative George often at loggerheads with the radical Welsh Prime Minister over policy in France, Ireland, and elsewhere. Moreover, recent studies have revealed the extent to which George involved himself in the politics of the British Army in France, and how this often saw him and Lloyd George intriguing against each other. Lloyd George was convinced Haig should not continue as the head of the British forces in France, and instead sought to strengthen the position of the French general and supreme Allied commander in France, Ferdinand Foch, at Haig's expense. Such actions aside, both George and Lloyd George's efforts to intervene in the military handling of the war were rendered largely null and void when the United States joined the war on the side of Britain and France in April 1917, thus making German defeat in the long run an all but certainty. Lloyd George and the king also clashed over another problematic matter which arose internationally in 1917. This concerned events in Russia, where a revolution had been initiated to overthrow the government of George III's cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, in February. This was a relatively conservative revolution at first, and there was the possibility of the Russian royal family being able to abscond from Russia and seek asylum elsewhere in Europe. At first, George was anxious to offer Nicholas the option of resettling, at least temporarily, in Britain. But Lloyd George was vehemently opposed, believing that the presence of the Russian imperial family in Britain could act as a lightning rod for socialist and revolutionary elements within Britain who were looking at Russia and considering whether an overthrow of the political system in Britain might also be possible. There were also concerns that the presence of the deposed Tsar in England could entangle Britain in Russia's domestic politics at a time when Russia was still theoretically its ally in the war. Although admittedly, Russian resistance to the German advance all along the Eastern Front was collapsing in the spring and summer of 1917. In the end, the king came to agree with Lloyd George's viewpoint. although the British Secret Services nevertheless prepared a plan for how to rescue Nicholas and his family from Russia, one which was never put into action. In the end, a more radical second revolution struck Russia in October 1917, bringing the Bolshevik communists to power. The Tsar and his family were murdered on the orders of the new government in Russia in the summer of 1918. The final years of the war also witnessed an intensification of the suffragist movement in Britain. The suffragettes had been campaigning for a decade and a half in Britain for women to be given the right to vote in political elections, a right which was still denied to women, and indeed many men, if they did not meet certain qualifying criteria. The suffragists had effectively engaged in a campaign of political pressure and limited violence over the years to fight for their cause. Indeed, George had been present at the Epsom Derby on the 4th of June 1913, when a suffragette, Emily Davison, ran out in front of the racing horses and attempted to catch hold of the king's own contender in the race, Anmer. The horse struck Davison as she attempted to grab the reins, and she died from her injuries 4 days later, becoming a suffragette martyr in the process. For his part, George had been more concerned for the horse and jockey in the aftermath of the incident, though in his defense he did not know the full extent of Davison's condition at the time. Now, nearly 5 years later, the king found himself giving the royal assent to the Representation of the People Act in February 1918, a bill which gave women of 30 years and over the right to vote, while also extending the male franchise to nearly 8 million poorer Britons. The act was a sign of how the First World War and the contribution of the British people to the war effort forced the political establishment to accelerate much-needed political reforms, such as those the suffragettes had campaigned for over many years. The Representation of the People Act was passed as the stalemate in the war on the continent was coming to an end. With the United States having joined the fight on the side of Britain and France, and with the economies of Germany and Austria-Hungary beginning to collapse under the pressure of 4 years of war, the strategic situation changed in the summer and autumn of 1918. It was over by November 1918, not owing to complete military victory, but because the governments in both Berlin and Vienna had fallen to domestic revolutions. Lloyd George led the British delegation to France in the summer of 1919, which negotiated the terms of the post-war settlement. The resulting Treaty of Versailles with Germany forced the German government to accept the blame for causing the war, stripped the country of all its colonies and a sizable proportion of its territory in Europe, and imposed huge war reparations payments on the German people for decades to come. It was a punitive peace settlement, one which was matched by the hubris displayed by the British and French governments in carving up the Middle East and the defeated nation as African colonies between them. Lloyd George sent a letter to the king on the 5th of August 1919, informing him that he believed the treaty was, quote, worthy of the heroism and endurance displayed by your majesty, his forces by sea, land, and air, and by all classes of your majesty's subjects who worked at home during the 5 years of grievous struggle. There was a great degree of truth to the Prime Minister's letter, but nevertheless, the treaty had sown into it the seeds of another war many years later. 2. Cessation of the conflict in November 1918 did not bring any respite to Europe. Indeed, the next 5 years were even deadlier for the continent. This was partly owing to the collapse of the old political order and numerous revolutions and civil wars in countries like Russia, Germany, and Turkey. Yet much of it was also owing to disease outbreaks at a time when the continent's people were weakened due to years of rationing and want. The disease which swept across Europe in 1918 and into 1919 is known as the Spanish flu. Even though it originated in the United States by early 1920, it had infected over 500 million people and is estimated to have killed somewhere between 20 and 50 million people, though reliable statistics for Asia and Africa are not available. The royal family was not immune to it, and indeed such were the ravages of disease outbreaks on the Windsors in recent decades, notably the death of George's older brother Albert Victor in 1892, that they were anxious to avoid contagion. Consequently, the royal court fled from London, but by then it was too late for the king to avoid the Spanish flu, just 2 months after it first surfaced in the U.S. George was struck by it in May 1918. He made a full recovery, though, something which cannot be said of many others. The Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, also contracted it and nearly died. While the Spanish flu had largely passed the king and his immediate family by in 1918, the revolutions which followed the end of the First World War would have a more enduring impact. These sprung up all across the continent, generally in the countries which were defeated during the war, such as Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the latter of which was fragmenting into several smaller states by the time the armistice was declared in November 1918. However, it was not confined to these, and some of the revolutions elsewhere impacted directly on the monarchy. Such was the case with the September 11, 1922, revolution, which occurred in Greece as a spillover from the Turkish Revolution. Here, senior officers within the Greek army and navy initiated a coup against the reigning government of King Constantine, George V's cousin. He was quickly replaced by his son, who became George II of Greece, but not without a severe backlash against the royals in the Mediterranean nation. Such was the danger implicit in this that George II had to send ships of the Royal Navy to the Mediterranean nation to rescue his cousins Prince Andrew and Princess Alice, the paternal grandparents of the present King of Britain, Charles III, from Greece. More broadly, George was skeptical about the revolutions which subsumed Europe at this time, viewing most as dangerously revolutionary and socialist, developments which George, as a conservative British monarch, was deeply opposed to. One of these revolutions was closer to home than all others. While Britain itself avoided conflict in the aftermath of the war, it could not prevent unrest across the Irish Sea in Ireland. In the decades since George had visited the country, just days after his coronation in England, Ireland's political problems had mounted. At the outset of the war in 1914, the Irish Parliamentary Party, the country's largest single political party at Westminster, had made an agreement with the government in England. It would convince Irish men to sign up for the war effort and head for the trenches of France. And in return, the British government would grant home rule to Ireland, whereby an Irish parliament would be established in Dublin, one which would rule many aspects of Ireland, albeit still as part of the British Empire. However, the war years saw this consensus fall apart. On Easter week in 1916, a coalition of nationalist revolutionaries led a botched military revolt against British rule, seizing large parts of Dublin. This was soon crushed, but in its aftermath, support for the Irish Parliamentary Party collapsed and was replaced with support for a new political movement, Sinn Féin. These won a landslide in nearly all the Irish constituencies outside of Ulster in the 1918 general election, and promptly refused to take their seats in Westminster, instead convening their own parliament in Dublin. It was the beginning of the Irish War of Independence. The War of Independence was fought in Ireland between 1919 and 1921. It was a bitter, bloody affair, with the Irish engaging in guerrilla warfare and the British government relying on army irregulars called the Black and Tans to fight the conflict. The latter were soon engaging in acts of atrocity and heavy-handed violence against the civilian population. For his part, while he was opposed to Irish independence, George was appalled by the escalating violence in Ireland and the tactics being employed by the Black and Tans. He censured Lloyd George on several occasions for what was occurring, and was a major driving force within England in finding a solution to the conflict. In the summer of 1921, a part of that solution was dividing Ireland so that the Scottish Presbyterians in the northern counties could have their own country that would remain closely tied to Britain. 6 counties there were partitioned from the south in May 1921, bringing Northern Ireland into existence. George visited Belfast in June to address the opening sitting of the new Unionist-dominated Parliament there. His speech is believed today to have been significant in preventing a war between the Unionists of the North and the Republicans of the South in the months that followed. Instead, a truce was agreed with the Republicans a few weeks later, and the south of Ireland was effectively granted partial independence from Britain, while the north remained part of the empire. Although a bitter civil war was fought in the south over the terms of independence between 1922 and 1923, the country remained tied to Britain in some particulars until the mid-1930s. George's role in establishing the peace in the early 1920s was quite substantial. Ireland was not the only issue confronting Britain's empire in the 1920s. The number of nations which had formed part of the empire, but which were now largely autonomous nations like South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand had been growing for some time. But the constitutional arrangement for these dominions was still largely unclear. Were they still part of the empire, wholly autonomous, or partially subject to Britain in terms of their foreign policy and certain trade matters. These issues came to a head at the Imperial Conference held in London in 1926, which was presided over by George and chaired by the former Prime Minister between 1902 and 1905, Arthur Balfour. Here an agreement was reached that the Dominions constituted a Commonwealth of nations, which were each equal to each other in their common allegiance to the Crown. Thus, under the terms of what has become known as the Balfour Declaration, the growing independence of Britain's former colonies was acknowledged, but a new Commonwealth centered on the monarchy and the rule of George V as head of state of the Commonwealth was put down in law. 5 years later, the Statute of Westminster of 1931 would grant further legislative independence to the Commonwealth nations. While these measures largely resolved the issues inherent in the status of the Dominions, there was still a major policy issue in the 1920s concerning the core element of Britain's Empire India, or the British Raj, as the great conglomeration of territory covering not just India but also modern-day Pakistan and Bangladesh. George was Emperor of India and indeed had visited Delhi in 1911, where he became the only British ruler of India to attend a Delhi Durbar or court to be proclaimed as emperor in person. Yet, despite his efforts to make himself physically present in India on occasion, George faced growing calls for Indian independence throughout his reign, particularly the non-violent opposition led by Mahatma Gandhi. The responses during George's reign were two bills, the Government of India Act of 1919 and the Government of India Act of 1935. Both sought to ensure British control of India for some time to come by offering moderate Indian nationalists a range of concessions, while also trying to take account of the varied religious and social tapestry that was the Raj. None of it was enough, though, and while George was not the last British emperor of India, it was largely during his reign that the independence movement gained sufficient traction to lead to independence in the mid-1940s. George's attitudes towards domestic British politics in the 1920s were a delicate balancing act between his role as a figurehead within the government and his own rather conservative political views. He, like many others in Britain, was wary of the emergence of the Labour Party as a major political movement. It created some dismay then for the King and large sections of the British political establishment when the general election of December 1923 resulted in a hung parliament with neither Stanley Baldwin's Conservatives, Herbert Asquith's Liberals, nor Ramsay MacDonald's Labour securing a majority. In the days that followed, it emerged that the only government which was feasible was a minority Labour administration, which would be supported on a case-by-case basis by the Liberals. Thus, MacDonald became Prime Minister, and Labour formed a government for the first time. There were genuine concerns at the time that George, whose constitutional roles involved officially appointing new governments, would try to block the formation of the new Labour regime. Yet, he didn't. Whatever his personal politics might have been, George knew that he was not supposed to intervene publicly in the politics of the day. Yet, there is also evidence that George's personal politics might have been shifting at this time. The minority government soon collapsed, and the Conservatives returned to power in late 1924. Yet, when a general strike broke out across the UK in 1926, over pay and working conditions in Britain's mines and other sectors of the economy, it was George who urged a moderate approach on the Conservative Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, stating that Baldwin needed to put himself in the shoes of the average working man when negotiating with the strike managers. While Britain's politics were difficult in the mid-1920s, any issues encountered were tempered by the fact that the global economy was booming during these years. Yet all this came to an end in the autumn of 1929 with the Wall Street crash and the ensuing Great Depression. At the time of the Wall Street crash, MacDonald had just led Labour back into government in remarkably bad timing. His administration faced a huge crisis with over 1.5 million people out of work across Britain by the start of the spring of 1930, a situation which deteriorated further over the next year and a half as the value of the pound sterling and its ties to the gold standard looked increasingly precarious. By August 1931, it was impossible for MacDonald to get any budgets or policies through. And so George urged the Labour leader to call an election and form a government of national unity. It was wise advice. A national government containing Labour, Conservative, and Liberal ministers was formed in October 1931, and the British political establishment worked together to move through the crisis created by the Great Depression. Whereas other nations ended up with increasingly fractious and extreme politics, George also facilitated the MacDonald governments to manage the economic crisis in other ways. The Civil List, which was effectively a list of individuals to whom the British government paid money in the form of honorary pensions, as well as royal subventions. This was perhaps at odds with his own personality. By nature, he was a rather diminutive, retiring figure, one whose favored pastimes were stamp collecting and hunting. Back in 1893, George had been made honorary vice president of the Royal Philatelic Society, the most significant stamp collecting society in the world. George served in that role until he became king, and his contributions to the society's collection were considerable. For instance, in 1904, he purchased a rare Mauritius 2-pence blue stamp for $150, a record for a single stamp purchase at that time. George ultimately contributed significantly to the Royal Philatelic collection, which is valued at approximately $100 million today. Elsewhere, George became the first monarch to take advantage of the new mass communications medium of radio to reach out to his subjects. On Christmas Day 1932, he became the first king or queen to address the entire nation in this way. George had resisted the idea of doing so for many years, believing radio was for entertainment rather than an extension of the political realm. But in the 1930s, as the crisis deepened across the country and other politicians, such as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the then governor of New York, began using radio to communicate with their constituents, George relented and gave the first royal Christmas speech in 1932. The King's speech was scripted by Rudyard Kipling, the great author of Kim and the Jungle Book, whose knowledge of the British Empire and British India in particular qualified him for writing a speech, which was broadcast to all of George's subjects, not just in Britain, but in the Raj and the Commonwealth nations as well. The speech sought to offer some comfort in the context of the tumultuous years Britain and citizens of the empire alike had just lived through. It may be that our future may lay upon us more than one stern test. Our past will have taught us how to meet it unshaken. For the present, the work to which we are all equally bound is to arrive at a reasoned tranquility within our borders to regain prosperity without self-seeking, and to carry with us those whom the burden of past years has disheartened or overborne. George's speech was a major success, and the tradition has continued almost uninterrupted ever since. While Britain ultimately managed to pull itself out of the Great Depression in the mid-1930s via the mainstream political parties forming a unity government and acting in unison with each other, the same was not true for other nations. In Germany in particular, the massive economic crisis provided the basis for the rise of extremist politics and ultimately the ascent to power early in 1933 of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. George was wary of the rise of the German fascists from the beginning, as were many within the political establishment in Britain, but few had as prescient a view of what might occur as did the king. In a meeting with the German ambassador to Britain, Leopold von Husch, in 1934, the king expressed concern about the jingoistic rhetoric emanating from Berlin, where the Nazis were already making noises about remilitarizing in contravention of the Treaty of Versailles and their desire to build a greater Germany by reclaiming the territory they had lost in 1918, and much more besides in Central and Eastern Europe. Von Husch, who was a career diplomat and not a Nazi ideologue, did not necessarily disagree. The following year, a more aggressive Nazi program of remilitarization was commenced. But George would not live to see the war between Britain and Germany, which so concerned him in his last years. George V suffered for much of his adult life from respiratory problems, a hereditary condition in the family, which was exacerbated by his chain smoking. By the time he was in his late 50s in the 1920s, he was suffering from severe bronchitis, and his ability to travel extensively was limited. Though doctors did recommend a visit to the Mediterranean in 1925, hoping that the warmer climate would lead to an improvement in his condition. It didn't, and further suggestions that he should do the same in later years were vociferously rejected by George. Instead, he accepted a certain level of ill health, which only continued to get worse as he entered his 60s, leaving London and the royal palaces in the home counties, only to spend time in the seaside resort of Bognor Regis in Sussex. Into the 1930s, Things only got worse, and by the middle of the decade, his respiratory problems had deteriorated to incorporate several other ailments, including breathing problems, a lack of energy, regular colds, and blood issues. It was clear that he did not have long left to live. George's imminent death was complicated to a very great extent by his relationship with his eldest son and heir, Edward, Prince of Wales. Edward had always been problematic. He did not display a strong character, and George was reluctant to pass too many responsibilities to him, even as his own health deteriorated from the mid-1920s onwards. Most worrying was Edward's love life. He had not married and produced an heir, but engaged in a string of short-lived romances. And when one finally seemed to stick in the mid-1930s, it was highly problematic. The subject of Edward's attentions was Wallis Simpson, an American divorcée who was still married to her second husband, Ernest Aldrich Simpson, an American with extensive business affairs in Britain. Edward and Wallis had entered into an affair in the mid-1930s, but it was considered unacceptable to the Conservative Party leader Stanley Baldwin, and viewed with great dubiousness by George V, who repeatedly advised his son to end the liaison and marry a more acceptable woman, one who would not have been divorced and was British or European. The issues inherent in Edward and Wallis's affair were still hanging over the succession, as George's health declined dramatically in the course of 1935. By the summer of 1935, the king was regularly receiving oxygen in order to continue breathing properly. Things got worse in the months that followed, and on the 15th of January 1936, he retreated to his bed at Sandringham House in Norfolk outside London. He spent the next 5 days here with his situation deteriorating precipitously. By the 18th, he was slipping in and out of consciousness and was in a confused state whenever he pulled himself back to the point of being able to converse with those surrounding his deathbed. It was clear that he was suffering by this point, and his royal physician, Bertrand Edward Dawson, was faced with a difficult decision. At approximately 11 p.m. on the night of the 20th of January 1936, he effectively decided to speed along the king's death, administering a large dose of morphine and cocaine sometime afterwards. Nothing could have been done to save the king's life, and the decision most likely spared George several further days of agony. Though Dawson's decision has been controversial ever since, owing to the fact that he did not consult with George's family before taking this action. Subsequent events are well known. A protracted royal funeral followed, with George eventually being laid to rest at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle on the 28th of January. Edward succeeded his father as King Edward VIII of Britain. However, he was steadfast in his determination to marry Wallis Simpson, who was now in the process of finalizing her second divorce from Ernest Simpson. This created a major problem. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and other members of the royal family, including Edward's younger brother Albert, were convinced that the British public would not stand for their king marrying a multiple divorcée from America. While it would clearly emerge in the process that the new king had begun seeing Wallis while she was still married, a constitutional crisis brewed in the months that followed as Edward refused to budge from his position. When he was eventually confronted by the government and the royal family, he agreed to abdicate the throne and married Simpson. His younger brother Albert succeeded the childless Edward in December 1936, taking the regal name George VI. Thus, less than 12 months after George V's death, the abdication crisis resulted in his younger son succeeding his older son. George V was in many ways one of Britain's least well-known monarchs, despite spending a quarter of a century on the throne. Perhaps this was because his reign was largely bookended by the even lengthier and more substantial reigns of his grandmother Queen Victoria, who ruled for much of the 19th century, and his granddaughter Elizabeth II, whose reign marked the transition from the post-war period through to the 21st century. Compared with these, George's period on the throne seems misleadingly brief and static. Moreover, today he is broadly overshadowed in the public imagination by other political figures of his time, notably David Lloyd George, who dominated the country's politics during the First World War, and then the rise of Winston Churchill during the interwar period. Furthermore, George was a modest character who preferred stamp collecting and spending time with family to courting controversy. A man whose interest lay in stamps cannot hope to vie with the Russian Civil War and the rise of the Nazis in the pages of history books detailing the interwar period of European history. Finally, George's lengthy reign was in many ways overshadowed immediately by the short, controversial reign of his elder son and the abdication crisis. Yet, to suggest that because George's reign was in many ways rather bland for its time, it was without merit would be to do it and the man a disservice. George provided simple, uncontroversial leadership as King of Britain during a tumultuous period of British and European history. From the outset, he was a man who disliked violence and wished to see the First World War ended as quickly as possible. In the aftermath of it, he approached the revolutions which Europe was inundated with in the late 1910s as something which needed to be overcome while maintaining a conservative political landscape. In the 1920s and 1930s, he largely stayed out of the way and let the politicians get on with dealing with a changing Britain and a troublesome Europe, which was effectively the role of the monarch by this time. George was hardworking, dutiful, and moderate. In many ways, he set the template for the modern monarchy, one which was followed in all major specifics by his son, King George VI, and his granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II. As such, while George V was in some ways an unremarkable monarch, he was also widely admired and liked by the British people by the time his considerable reign came to an end in the mid-1930s. Chapters 02. Edward VIII, the Traitor King and Royal Scandal. Edward, later King Edward VIII and Emperor of India, was born on June 23, 1894, at White Lodge, Richmond Park, Surrey. His father, George, was the eldest son of Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to Queen Victoria, who ruled since 1837. By 1894, with Queen Victoria in her 70s, Edward's grandfather was poised to succeed her as Edward VII, making young Edward second in line upon Victoria's death in 1901. Edward's mother, Mary of Teck, daughter of a German duke, and George had 6 children, 5 sons and 1 daughter. Edward, the eldest, was followed by Albert, named for Victoria's late husband. Fully named Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, he was called David by family. Raised as a future king, Edward faced a distant upbringing. His parents, stern and often detached, created a tense home with his father's outbursts, leaving Edward feeling unloved, shaping his later choice to remain childless. Known for his charm and social ease, he mixed across classes, though his intellect was modest. Educated at York Cottage, Sandringham, and Frogmore, Windsor, he moved to Osborne Naval College as a teen, then the Royal Naval College, and served on HMS Britannia, mirroring his father's training. Despite his royal status, Edward faced bullying in the Navy and received little intellectual rigor, unlike earlier royals, leaving him with a narrow worldview. In May 1910, his grandfather's death made his father king, and at 15, Edward became Prince of Wales, thrust into public life. He attended Oxford, but was a lukewarm student, distracted by Europe's brewing unrest. In 1914, World War I erupted, sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, igniting tensions from Germany's rise, colonial rivalries, and Balkan nationalism. Britain, France, and Russia faced Germany and Austria-Hungary in brutal trench warfare in northern France. Edward joined the Grenadier Guards in July 1914, relishing the camaraderie absent in his studies. His service, however, was sheltered. Royals couldn't risk capture or death. He took on symbolic roles like meeting French generals and boosted morale inspecting British camps. Rare dangers included a 1916 car crash in France after his chauffeur's death by artillery. He also visited the Middle East in 1916, connecting with Australian and New Zealander allies. The war was significant in one other way, which would have a small implication for Edward and his family for decades to come. At the outset of the conflict, the royal family was known as the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. This had been established in 1901 following the succession of King Edward VII, bringing the House of Hanover, which had ruled Britain for nearly 2 centuries, to an end. However, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which was assigned on account of the extensive links between the British royal family and many of the most senior royal lines within Germany, became problematic in the context of the First World War. It reminded far too many people that the royals had extensive amounts of German blood. And indeed, George V was the first cousin of the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. In particular, when the Germans began dropping bombs on London in 1917 from planes named Gotha bombers, it was clear it was no longer tenable to retain the royal title. Consequently, in July 1917, the royal house's name was changed to that of the House of Windsor, a name adopted owing primarily to the long-standing associations between the English crown and Windsor Castle to the west of London. The war was eventually won in November 1918, and so this name change had little consequence thereafter in practical terms, but the new Windsor name would become associated intimately with Edward in due course. The end of the war opened up the issue of Edward marrying and fathering an heir to secure the line of succession. However, Edward's father, unlike most other previous monarchs, was open to allowing Edward to decide his marital affairs for himself, and the British public were more keen by the late 1910s and 1920s that some form of mutual affection should play a part in the selection of a future queen by the prince. Edward was not in any rush either. Rather, as the bloodshed of the 1910s gave way to the economic boom and social excesses of the 1920s, Edward became a regular attender at London nightclubs and dance halls, where an entourage attached themselves to the future king. He also began an affair with Winifred Dudley Ward, who was already married with 2 small children to William Dudley Ward, the grandson of Lord Esher in the British nobility. Eventually, Ward divorced her husband, and the affair became extremely serious in the 1920s, although Edward did also see several other women intermittently throughout these years. However, the relationship with Ward would never result in marriage, even after she divorced her first husband, and it was eventually ended by Edward in 1934. This penchant for the high life, and Edward's complicated love life, had created concerns within the government and amongst the royals themselves during the 1920s. Compounding this was what was perceived as Edward's quasi-egalitarian manners and habits. During his time in military service during the war, the prince had become used to trying to find common ground with the rank-and-file soldiers, and he continued his efforts to do so during royal visits abroad to Canada and other regions in the 1920s. His easy manner with ordinary people would be viewed positively in a member of the royal family today. But in the interwar period nearly a century ago, the royals, senior politicians, and the nobles of the realm looked at this disapprovingly. Moreover, many looked at Edward as a monarch who might try to exercise too much political independence when he became king, rather than a figure who would carry out the ceremonial duties of being monarch, which was effectively what the monarchy had been in England since the early 18th century. Thus, already by the late 1920s, there was growing concern about the prince's behavior and attitudes within senior political circles, ones which were no doubt expressed in private, when King George developed a serious illness that lasted for several months in 1928 and 1929. He recovered and would reign for several more years, but there were worrying signs of a clash between his successor and the political realm in years to come. In the early 1930s, Edward met the woman who would determine the course of the remainder of his life. Wallis Simpson was an American socialite from Pennsylvania who was born as Bessie Wallace Warfield. 2 years Edward's junior, she had grown up in Baltimore, and she and her mother had been supported by wealthy extended family members after her father died during her youth. In 1916, she had married Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., an American Air Force pilot. It was a fractious marriage, and while it lasted over a decade, long before they eventually divorced in 1927, the pair had spent extended periods of time apart. The following year, Wallis married Ernest Simpson, an American by birth, who had developed extended business connections in Britain. As a result of his business dealings, the Simpsons were largely living in England by the early 1930s, where Wallis was moving in high society circles. Much of their social ascent was a mirage, though, and Ernest Simpson's business affairs had run into serious trouble following the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed. This undoubtedly placed some strain on his and Wallis's marriage in the early 1930s, around the time that she was first introduced to Prince Edward. 1934 was a pivotal year in the development of the relationship between the prince and Wallis Simpson. That year, he decided to end his sporadic affairs with Freda Dudley Ward and other mistresses, such as Lady Furness. Curiously enough, His fascination with Mrs. Simpson seems to have derived from her being the more dominant individual within the relationship. Edward maintained a childlike personality throughout his adult life, and Simpson, as so many reports of the mid-1930s would assert, seemed to have the prince completely under her thumb. For his part, Edward was clearly besotted by her, and it seems evident that by 1934 or 1935 he had determined to marry her, and for Simpson to become queen consort one day. There were early signs that this would not prove possible, though. When Edward introduced his American lover to his father and mother, they were not impressed. And indeed, there were even special branch police assigned to monitor the couple's movements from 1935 onwards. There were two major issues at hand. The first being the fact that Simpson was a divorcée, and on religious and moral grounds it would be disapproved of for the future King of England to marry such a woman, and for her to become queen. Simpson's American background and reports that she had excessive influence over Edward were also paramount in the minds of worried observers in the mid-1930s. The question of who would become queen consort became a pressing one before too long. On the 20th of January 1936, at 70 years of age, King George V died, and Edward was proclaimed as King Edward VIII the following day. At first, there were positive signs. George V had been an ill man for many years, and his chronic respiratory problems had often taken from his ability to serve as monarch. Moreover, he was perceived in the public eye as an antiquated figure, one who belonged more to the world of the late 19th century than the new emerging world of the interwar period. This public enthusiasm for a new monarch after a long reign was not an entirely unusual feature of British political life, but in Edward's case, it would prove unfounded. The new king seems to have given almost no thought to how he would reign when he succeeded his father. Nevertheless, it quickly became clear that Edward was the polar opposite of his father, in that he had very little interest in the actual affairs of state. Ministers would present him with documents and state papers which he would give almost no attention to. Rather, he seemed to be content to carry on his life much as he had before, including maintaining an active social schedule in London. Within weeks, many at Westminster and elsewhere were troubled by what they saw. Edward's distracted nature was all the more worrying because when George V died, it was a moment of some considerable difficulty in world politics. The legacy of the First World War was immense. In Eastern Europe, the Russian Revolution had broken out in 1917 and resulted after many years of civil war in the emergence of the Soviet Union as a major world power, one which was ideologically opposed to nations like Britain. In the Far East, the Empire of Japan was ascendant as the dominant power there, and several years earlier in 1931 had begun aggressively expanding on the Asian mainland by conquering the Chinese province of Manchuria. In Western Europe, Spain was about to descend into a vicious civil war after years of instability, whilst elsewhere on the continent, fascist regimes and authoritarian governments had seized power in countries like Italy, Austria, and Hungary. Compounding the growth of extremist politics was the economic crisis which began in 1929 with the Wall Street crash, and which resulted in years of profound economic depression in the early 1930s. In this landscape, Britain was a bastion of relative stability. Edward's job as king would be to try to maintain this and Britain's empire in India and Africa. However, of all the problems confronting Europe, none was as great as that posed by Germany. The country had been left demoralized and destabilized by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had been imposed on the country by Britain and France in 1919. This reassigned large amounts of formerly German territory to its neighbors and imposed huge financial reparations on the country while also heavily restricting the size of its military. Nevertheless, after several years of crisis in the late 1910s and early 1920s, the German Republic had entered a period of relative stability in the mid-1920s and was the cultural center of the continent. But the economic crisis of the late 1920s and early 1930s hit Germany particularly badly. As it did, an extremist party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, managed to claim power early in 1933 after years of electoral gains. They soon turned Germany into a one-party dictatorship, and in the 12 months prior to Edward's accession had begun aggressively rearming in contravention of the Treaty of Versailles. One might have expected that Edward's reign would be characterized by opposition to Nazi aggression. But events were quickly to ensure that the reign was brief, and Edward was soon cozying up to the Germans in ways that have cast a shadow over his entire life ever since. Edward was known to sympathize with elements of the Nazi regime in Germany, an issue which would create untold controversy before too long. But the more pressing issue in the first months of his reign was that of his relationship with Mrs. Simpson. At first, it was not clear how much difficulty this would create. But when the foreign newspapers began covering the new king's holiday on a yacht in the Mediterranean with Simpson shortly into his reign, unease began to emerge among government ministers in London. The offer to visit Germany was extended to Edward in the late summer of 1937 from Dr. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labor Front, an organization which had been set up by the Nazis in Germany to replace the trade unions and stifle any socialist agitation in the country. The offer was extended from this body as figures like Edward and Lloyd George the year beforehand were being invited to the country principally to view how Germany had overcome its economic woes and was running its factories through bodies like the Labor Front. Edward accepted, seemingly based on a desire to rejuvenate his profile in the aftermath of his kingship. A tour of the United States was also planned, and he seems to have developed the idea that he could act as an individual who might foster new ideas about how to avoid political conflicts across the Western world, like those which had engulfed Spain and cast it into civil war. Essentially, Edward wanted to visit Germany to see how the further spread of communism and radical socialism could be avoided. Thus, by the early autumn of 1937, he had accepted the offer, and news of the impending visit was relayed to the British ambassador in Berlin, George Ogilvy Forbes. The tour commenced on the morning of the 11th of October when the Windsors arrived at Friedrichstrasse station in Berlin. Despite being billed as a private tour rather than a royal visit, the couple were met at the station not just by Robert Ley, but by Joachim von Ribbentrop as well, who was soon to be appointed as the German foreign minister, and still held the title of German ambassador to the United Kingdom. The trip thereafter lasted for 12 days down to the 23rd of October. Much of it consisted, as Lloyd George's had the previous year, of visits to German factories and various government installations. These went from the mundane, such as a tour of a light bulb factory, to the sinister, notably a trip to a newly built concentration camp, which the Windsors were admittedly deceived about regarding its true purpose. Other visits included ones to Hitler youth rallies and factories belonging to major German companies like Krupp's. The dominant theme throughout was to present an image of efficient German industry with well-run factories, a nation that had returned to work after the economic difficulties of the early 1930s, and happy and enthusiastic workers. There were also considerable efforts made to highlight Britain's cultural closeness to Germany, with the two nations' national anthems being played whenever Edward and Wallis arrived at a factory or academy. The goal throughout was to impress on the couple that Germany was a model for how to prevent the spread of radical socialism on the continent, and that the Nazis were natural allies of the British. Throughout their visit, the Windsors met with several of the most senior members of the Nazi regime. For instance, on their first evening in Berlin, the couple were brought to dinner at Horcher's, a popular haunt of the Nazi senior leadership in the capital by von Ribbentrop, along with the German architect and later Minister of Armaments Albert Speer and the Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda. More controversially, Edward and Wallis met Hermann Goering, the head of the newly formed German Air Force and Hitler's second-in-command, at his hunting estate outside Berlin on the 14th of October. This included a meeting in Goering's study, where the Nazi minister had a map of Central Europe on the wall, one which depicted Austria as forming part of a Nazi-controlled Greater Germany, despite the implication that Germany intended to take over an independent neighbor before long. Edward did not raise any objections. When this was combined with news of the Duke and Duchess visiting armaments factories where German tanks, armored vehicles, and submarines were clearly being constructed, and Edward's offering of the Nazi salute to many officials during the trip, it is not difficult to see how concerns arose surrounding it and endured thereafter. If the impression conveyed to contemporaries and to posterity by the Windsors' near 2-week stay in Germany were not bad enough, It culminated with a personal meeting between Hitler and Edward on the 22nd of October. This occurred at the Berghof, the Nazi leader's alpine retreat on the southern border between Germany and Austria. There are varying accounts of the meeting and the subsequent conversation after Wallis joined them later on. For instance, some suggest it was a rather insignificant meeting with social niceties expressed, some vague feelings of amity between the German and British nations swapped and compliments exchanged, followed by tea. Others, though, have claimed that Edward indicated his active support for Germany's increasingly aggressive foreign policy and Hitler's desire to acquire lands in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. There certainly is no suggestion that the former king attempted to discourage German expansionism. Finally, when the meeting had concluded, the former king and the German chancellor departed by giving each other the Nazi salute. Unsurprisingly, the issue of what may or may not have been discussed in Germany during the Windsor's visit, especially during Edward's meetings with Hitler, Goering, and others, has aroused considerable controversy. Some have suggested that discussion veered into talk of Edward facilitating an alliance between Germany and Britain, as Germany expanded on the continent and prevented a further rise of communism. These theories have been fueled by the fact that the minutes of the meeting between Hitler and Edward on the 22nd of October were subsequently destroyed. What did they contain that warranted their destruction? Other evidence is open to interpretation. For instance, on the final night of their tour, the Windsors were entertained in Munich by Rudolf Hess, Hitler's long-standing private secretary, and his wife Ilse. At one point, Rudolf and Edward disappeared for about an hour, leaving behind their interpreters and all other staff. An hour later, they were found upstairs. Rudolf was allegedly showing Edward his collection of model ships. But was he really, or was something more sinister being discussed? While there is extensive disagreement among historians about the trip, what has been universally accepted by biographers of Edward and historians of the royals in the mid-20th century is that it demonstrated a startling lack of judgment on the former king's part one, which has forever shrouded his life in ignominy. And it didn't just end when the Windsors departed from Germany on the 23rd of October 1937. As we will see, fresh rumors and concerns abounded during the Second World War, ones which Edward and Wallis did nothing to dispel. Following their trip to Germany, Edward and Wallis returned to Paris, where they rented a mansion on the Boulevard Suchet, in which they lived in the late 1930s. As they were settling there, the Germans were intensifying their aggression on the world stage. Already during their visit to Germany in 1937, Hitler had been applying ever greater pressure on Austria to force it into a political union with Berlin. The Anschluss, creating a Greater Germany, was finally achieved in March 1938 in violation of the Versailles Treaty. Within weeks, Hitler was pressing the case for the annexation of the Sudetenland, a part of Western Czechoslovakia with a largely ethnic German population. At a conference in Munich in September 1938, Britain and France caved in to Hitler's demands, but insisted that any further Nazi attempts at expansion at the expense of Germany, his neighbors, would result in war. In the spring of 1939, when he annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia and the city of Memel in the Baltic States region. However, when German tanks rolled over the border into Poland at the very beginning of September 1939, appeasement could no longer be allowed. Britain and France declared war 2 days later, as the Second World War commenced. For the former king and his wife in France, they, like everyone else in the country, must have assumed a German invasion would come soon. However, as the autumn turned into winter and then 1940 dawned with Poland long conquered by the Germans and no westward campaign having occurred, many began to talk of a phony war. The spring robbed Europe of such hopes. In April 1940, the Nazis invaded Denmark and tactically occupied the key cities and towns of Norway. Just weeks later, an invasion of the Low Countries and France was initiated. This action aroused fresh concerns about Edward, who was accused by some British diplomats of having leaked information to Berlin, which had facilitated the German assault on Belgium. The accusation was especially damning when the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, to France became trapped at the town of Dunkirk in late May, as a result of the unexpected success of the German two-pronged assault of Belgium and northeast France. Only a daring amphibious rescue operation prevented hundreds of thousands of British troops from either being obliterated or captured. The French, though, were not so lucky, and on the 14th of June 1940, Paris was occupied by the Nazis. The city and France in general would remain under German control for the next 4 years. Notwithstanding their earlier friendliness towards the Nazis, the Duke and Duchess were the targets of a conspiracy by Hitler and the Nazi paramilitary organization, the SS, in the summer of 1940. The goal of what was codenamed Operation Willy was to kidnap the Windsors who had left Paris when France was invaded in May 1940, heading south to Biarritz and then journeying over the border into Spain with the ultimate goal of reaching Portugal. Operation Willy was conceived while they were traveling through Spain, which under the fascist dictatorship of General Francisco Franco was friendly towards Hitler's government. The idea was that the Duke would be kidnapped, brought to Germany, and then his alleged pro-German inclinations would be fostered with a view to re-establishing him as King of England following the German defeat of Britain in the war. By the time plans were at an advanced stage, the Windsors had already crossed into Portugal and were living in Lisbon by the first days of July 1940. At this juncture, a new plan was settled on whereby Edward would be tricked into crossing back into Spain and detained there. But even Walter Schellenberg, the SS official who was placed in charge of the operation and who subsequently became the head of Nazi foreign intelligence, later conceded that the plan was ludicrous. Operation Willy was never brought to fruition, but the arrival of the Windsors in Lisbon and the ever-present lack of tact displayed by Edward and Wallis on their arrival there opened them up to further charges of engaging in traitorous activity, ones which, like their visit to Germany in 1937, have created long-lasting suspicions that have never been entirely resolved. The Windsors had apparently elected to make their way to Spain and Portugal in May 1940, owing to anxieties about their diminished status in Britain and certain tax burdens that would fall on them if they returned home. Back in Britain, this failure to return to England looked very bad, and the new Prime Minister Winston Churchill looked at it particularly disapprovingly. Matters only became more suspicious when the Windsors arrived in Portugal and promptly accepted an offer to stay in the home of Ricardo Espírito Santo, a Portuguese banker who had extensive business connections in Germany and who was suspected of having sufficient contacts with Hitler and the Nazis that MI6, the British intelligence service, had opened a file on him. Perhaps Edward and Wallis were unaware of this, but it seems unlikely. And in accepting the offer to stay with Santo, the former king was either involved in talks with Santo or was acting in an incredibly irresponsible manner, one which almost guaranteed that his loyalty would be questioned. Yet, there was worse still. Recent research has revealed that while he was in Portugal, Edward promoted the idea through Ricardo Espírito Santo that the Nazis should, quote, bomb Britain into peace. Edward here was apparently proposing that the Nazis should adopt a strategy of aerial bombing over England, and London in particular, in order to force the British government into surrendering without the necessity of a land invasion. This was effectively the strategy which the Germans adopted in the summer of 1940, leading to the Blitz of London and England for the next year. This recent study has highlighted how Edward had proposed the Blitz while in Portugal, and that the same advice was then conveyed to the Nazi government in Berlin by the German ambassador in Lisbon. It is possible that Edward viewed this as the lesser of two evils compared to a land invasion. But there is still absolutely no denying that coming from a member of the royal family, this advice constituted treason of the highest kind. In the months that followed, tens of thousands of bombs were dropped on Britain, leading to approximately 40,000 civilian deaths. In September and October 1940 alone, London was bombed almost every single night. Edward seemingly advocated that Berlin should adopt this strategy in order to force the country into surrendering, and to make him King of Britain again in the aftermath of the capitulation. Edward's possible duplicity while in Lisbon did not end along with his brief sojourn in Portugal. As soon as he and Wallis arrived there, Churchill had taken steps to remove Edward from continental Europe, while also avoiding bringing him back to Britain. He could not have the Duke residing on the continent and possibly falling into Nazi hands. The possibility that he would collude with the Nazis and potentially work out a deal to be made King of England once again was now too great. At the same time, Edward's actions in fleeing to Portugal and in visiting Germany back in 1937 made him a liability if he were to be brought back to England. Accordingly, Churchill had a statement sent to Lisbon that Edward had been appointed as the new governor of the Bahamas. However, 2 weeks after leaving Portugal, Edward engaged in possibly his most incriminating behavior. Yet, on the 15th of August, 1940, he sent a telegram to Espírito Santo, his and Wallis's Portuguese host, asking him to send word as soon as he needed to act. When this document was made public in 1957, Edward dismissed its significance. However, there seems to be evidence that Edward wanted to be updated by a known German agent about any developments that might lead to him returning to Europe to be installed as a puppet king of England if Germany defeated Britain in the war. Suspicions about Edward and his wife's actions over the past several years were considerable enough that when the couple decided to visit the United States from the Bahamas in the spring of 1941, they were monitored by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, at the behest of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI acted on information supplied by a German monk living in the U.S. who claimed to have information that Wallis Simpson had been the lover of Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, back in 1936 when he had served as the Nazi ambassador to Britain. Suspicions were also aroused by a different English informant who claimed that Edward had made an arrangement with Hermann Göring that if the war ended in German victory, Göring would then attempt to overthrow Hitler and subsequently install Edward as King of England. How much of this was based on solid information and how much was just the wild imaginings of FBI informants is very difficult to know. However, it is indicative of the concern that attached itself to Edward and Wallis during the war years, that they were shadowed by FBI agents during this first visit to Florida from the Bahamas in 1941, and again on several further occasions after the U.S. entered the war in December 1941. We may never be able to disentangle fact from fiction when it comes to Edward's dealings with the Nazis, but we can be sure of one thing. Any plot he might have been engaged in did not materialize. Instead, Edward and Wallis spent the period from the autumn of 1940 through to the end of the war in 1945, largely ensconced in the Bahamas, a region which Edward dismissively referred to as a third-rate colony. He was contemptuous of the natives whom he viewed as racially inferior to their colonial overlords. As a consequence, he might have been the worst individual imaginable to have been charged with quieting serious riots over low wages across the islands, which occurred in the summer of 1942. However, Edward handled these diplomatically, and as governor of the island, he introduced a policy of poor relief and public works to try to both develop the islands and assuage ill will against Crown rule. Nevertheless, he and Wallis were eager to leave what they considered to be a colonial backwater to which they had been banished. And in mid-March 1945, months before the war ended, the former king resigned his commission as governor of the island archipelago. While Edward and Wallis spent their time in the Bahamas and were being trailed in the U.S. by FBI agents, the war effort began to turn against the Germans. Hitler had decided to suspend efforts to conquer Britain late in 1940 and instead turned his attention towards the Soviet Union. A massive invasion, the largest in the history of warfare, was initiated in the summer of 1941. That winter, the German Third Reich reached its greatest extent as German troops reached Moscow and Leningrad. However, they failed to take the cities, and by 1942, Russian resistance had turned the war into a stalemate on the Eastern Front. Thereafter, Germany's position gradually collapsed as resources ran out. The U.S. entry into the war late in 1941 began to have an impact, and the infinitely superior manpower of the Soviet Union became the deciding factor on the Eastern Front. By the summer of 1943, the Russians were pushing the Germans back towards Poland and Ukraine, and the Western Allies successfully opened a new front in southern Italy. By the time the Western Front was opened in the summer of 1944 by the Western Allies in France, it was really a matter of who would reach Berlin first, the Soviets from the east or the British and Americans from the west. In the end, it was the Russians, with the Western Allies occupying western and southern Germany. The war came to an end in early May 1945, days after Hitler killed himself in Berlin. In the immediate aftermath of the war, despite the many unanswered questions that still hung over Edward's conduct, Both in the years leading up to the war and during it, he was not overtly criticized within the British press. Nevertheless, there was a clear desire for both he and Wallis to resume the arrangement that had been in place in the late 1930s. They would return to France and live there rather than in Britain, where their presence could be problematic. However, even when they had settled again in Paris, as Europe was being rebuilt, another issue arose that allowed Edward to begin scheming once again. His brother, King George VI, was suffering ill health at a relatively young age due to his chronic smoking. The possibility of his having to step aside or dying was already acute by the mid-1940s. From afar, Edward engaged in correspondence with individuals in England in which he suggested that he could return to Britain and potentially serve as regent for his young niece, Princess Elizabeth, whom he claimed would otherwise fall under the influence of her Mountbatten in-laws. The scheme never came to anything, and George would, in any event, live on until 1952, by which time Elizabeth was well into her mid-20s. But it is indicative of the ceaselessly ambitious conniving of Edward that even after the ignominy which followed him in the aftermath of the war had developed, he continued to assess ways of re-entering British public life. Notably, he did not attend Elizabeth's coronation, but watched it on television from Paris. It was though to be the last of his foray in this regard. When Elizabeth did succeed and began a long and prosperous reign in 1952, her uncle and his wife resigned themselves to life in Paris. There they became a sort of curious celebrity couple, the former King of Britain and his American wife, who had done so much to unsettle Britain's politics before the war. They hobnobbed with British expats in the city and engaged in France's post-war café society. Meanwhile, Edward supplemented the extensive income they had and financial perks which persisted from the arrangement reached with the British government in the late 1930s by engaging in illegal currency trading. He also took up his pen to author A King's Story, a memoir published in 1951 that set out his opposition to the species of liberal politics dominating the post-war world in Western Europe and North America. It was also the first book by a former, or indeed sitting King of England to have been published since 1688. Furthermore, as the early 1950s turned into the mid to late 1950s, they began to visit the United States more frequently, socializing with politicians and celebrities and even visiting the White House during the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower. As such, they became a celebrity couple of sorts, albeit a curious one, but one which seemed to pose no further danger to the stability of public life. Back home in Britain, Wallis and Edward's relationship remained something of a mystery to many who commented on it in the post-war period. Several who had spent time with them during the 1950s noted that they seemed very distant from one another, rarely addressing things to the other directly. It was a strange dynamic for a couple whose relationship had apparently been so intense 20 years earlier that Edward was willing to give up the crown for her. For a while in the mid-1960s, they returned to Britain and spent a considerable amount of time there, attending various royal events which occurred from 1965 onwards, notably the funeral of Princess Marina of Kent, who was Edward's sister-in-law through her marriage to his brother who, somewhat confusingly, was also known as George, the same name as his brother the King, who had adopted George as his regal name but had been christened Albert. Edward, like Marina, was not far away from the grave himself. By now, in his early 70s, he was facing a mounting number of health problems, most related to his chronic smoking. In between attending events in Britain in the mid-1960s, he regularly flew to America to attend doctors there and had a number of different surgical procedures carried out, notably to relieve his coronary problems. Eventually, the prince's lifetime smoking habit caught up with him. In the early 1970s, throat cancer was diagnosed. It was inoperable and terminal. By this time, he and Wallis had ensconced themselves in Paris, but though the former king did not have long left to live, he was able to receive a visit from his niece Queen Elizabeth II, who fortuitously was on a state visit to France right around that time. Edward died on the 28th of May, 1972 in Paris. His body was quickly removed to England, where it lay in state at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, rather than at Westminster Hall. Somewhat surprisingly, a large percentage of the British public filed by in the days that followed to pay their last respects to the king who had briefly ruled 3.5 decades earlier. The funeral service was held on the 5th of June in the presence of Queen Elizabeth, the royal family, and Wallis Simpson. Thereafter, he was buried at the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore. This was perhaps surprising, as there had been considerable speculation over the years as to where in Britain, if at all, Edward would be buried. In death, as in life, the former king was a subject of political intrigue. Edward's widow did not have a good life after his passing. Wallis continued to live in France and was financially supported by her late husband's estate and an allowance from Queen Elizabeth, but her health was declining, and by the late 1970s, she was developing advanced dementia. She was also increasingly frail and prone to falling over, resulting in her breaking her hip twice, while from 1980 onwards she lost the ability to speak. Thus, her later years were spent largely housebound and with her mental faculties sharply deteriorating. To compound matters, she was being taken advantage of by her French lawyer, Suzanne Blum, who assumed power of attorney for the increasingly incapacitated Wallis. Blum used her position to exploit Simpson financially. Eventually, Wallis died in Paris on the 24th of April 1986 at 89 years of age. Her funeral was held a few days later at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Her marriage to Edward, which had faced so many difficulties and aroused many different controversies, had survived the distance, despite these adversities, and she was interred next to him near Windsor Castle. King Edward VIII was one of the most controversial figures in modern British public life. In 1936, he ascended to the throne of Britain, and as Emperor of India, when he was still a bachelor, in his early 40s. However, while unmarried and without an heir, he was still an individual who had a varied love life. And that was the problem. Not only was the new king known for his extensive social life as Prince of Wales in the 1920s and 1930s, but he was also a figure of widespread gossip on account of his numerous liaisons with married women. One of these was problematic from the start of his brief reign. By 1934, Edward had become besotted with Wallis Simpson, an American who had already divorced once and who would need to do so again in order to marry Edward. When it became clear that this was exactly what the pair intended, it became a matter of national controversy. It has been widely debated ever since whether the issue of Simpson being a multiple divorcee was the real reason for Edward being forced to abdicate at the end of 1936, or if he was simply unpopular within political and social circles, and Simpson was used as a means to force him out in favor of the much more respectable George VI. Whatever the reason, the end product was the same. Edward abdicated, making him the shortest reigning monarch in nearly 5 centuries. Had matters rested there, we might look on Edward today as a sympathetic character, one who had the crown stolen from him, owing to antiquated views on religion and marital morality, which pertained in the 1930s. But what followed tarnished his reputation irreparably. In the autumn of 1937, Edward, who had always harbored sympathies towards the Nazi regime which had emerged in Germany in 1933, undertook a tour of the country, one in which he met with such odious characters as Hermann Goering, Joseph Goebbels, and finally Adolf Hitler himself. There is no doubt Edward was in favor of fascism as a bulwark against socialism in Europe. What conspiracies might have been plotted in 1937 is unclear, but we do know that in 1940, when the Nazis quickly conquered France, Edward and Wallis adopted home. The couple were involved with Nazi agents across Western Europe in the months that followed. Was Edward plotting to return as King of Britain in a Nazi-dominated Europe? We cannot be sure. But what is perfectly clear is that in acting in the way in which he did, and opening himself up to the aspersions which he did, Edward forever tarnished himself as the possible traitor king. What do you think of King Edward's fate? Do you think he was conspiring as blatantly with Adolf Hitler and the German Nazi Party as many believed? Or was he simply somebody who liked to arouse controversy? And that's the end of part 1 of our serene Windsor tale. From the steadfast leadership of George V through the romantic drama of Edward VIII's abdication for love, we've drifted through an era of remarkable transformation. If this story brought you a bit of peace tonight, don't forget to like, comment your favorite monarch, and subscribe so you never miss a dreamy dive into history. Next time on Sleepy Crown, we'll continue our Windsor journey with Part 2, exploring the courageous George VI, who overcame his stutter to lead Britain through World War II, and the legendary Queen Elizabeth II, whose remarkable 70-year reign shaped the modern world. Rest well, dear friend. May your sleep tonight be deep, your dreams gentle, and your heart calm. Good night from Dreamy Historian.